Well, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of my distinguished fellow panelists, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this session, Alzheimer's, a Global Call for Action. I want to go over some ground rules for this particular session. It's a 1-hour-long session. We're going to start out with some remarks from the panelists. Then towards the end of the session, we're going to have about 20 minutes for questions. So we really welcome questions from you, as provocative as you can make them. Okay? So how many people here have a family member or someone close to them that has been affected by Alzheimer's or dementia? See, the vast majority. And this is good because we're going to be doing a short poll with all of you, with your permission. I'm going to ask 3 short questions because these 3 questions have also been posed to the World Economic Forum's Twitter audience, and we have the results from that poll. And I would share with you how your results compare with the results of the Twitter poll. So my first question is, are you optimistic that an effective drug for slowing Alzheimer's will be on the market by 2030? Those who believe yes, please raise your hands. Okay, I see. Pretty good. Okay. So the Twitter poll of about 500 people on the World Economic Forum's site found about 77% said yes, so which is very good news, and we'll see what our panel has to add to that. The second question is also very interesting. If there was a test to predict Alzheimer's before the onset of symptoms, would you take it? And that's how the question is worded. So assume it's today. So those who feel yes, please raise your hands. Okay, I would say about, maybe about 60% of the room, I guess. So the Twitter poll was about 86% said yes, they would take it, which I thought was very interesting. So they actually want to know before symptoms develop. And the third is even more provocative. So gene editing techniques be developed to deliver babies free of genes associated with Alzheimer's disease. So raise your hand if your answer is yes. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, very few. So maybe about 30% of the room. And surprisingly, on Twitter, about 66% said yes. So with that background, I want to share with you a few facts about Alzheimer's to set the stage before I introduce the distinguished panel. I think everybody has heard of the disease. It's the great brain robbery. And one of my friends often jokes, in the next 25 years, there'll be only 2 kinds of people, those with Alzheimer's and those caring for people with Alzheimer's disease, right? One of the benefits of living longer is we enjoy a rich life, but aging is also one of the biggest risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And as a consequence, in the last 115 years, we've gone from the first published case to something like 45 million cases worldwide. And the numbers could triple over the coming decades if we don't find an effective cure, which is one reason why we have selected these 3 distinguished panelists, and you will hear some more from them. Alzheimer's costs about $1 trillion to society, both in direct costs and in indirect costs that caregivers put in. There's probably something like 50, 60 million caregivers around the world, and it takes an enormous human toll, not just on the person with the disease, but also caregivers. We've made tremendous progress over the last 10 years, but we've also had a lot of failures. And I think we need to come together, governments, private industry, civil society, all of us, researchers and academia, need to come together to find solutions in a rapid way. And that's the reason why we convened this panel. And the goals of this panel should be a call to action. What is it that we can do? Okay. So with that, it's my honor to introduce our panelists. To my right is Dr. Andrea Pfeifer, who is Chief Executive Officer of AC Immune in Switzerland. I'm going to keep the introductions brief. Otherwise, if I had packed all their CVs, I wouldn't have had room for my clothes in my suitcase. She's a technology pioneer at the World Economic Forum, has also been named as a Swiss Entrepreneur of the Year. She's both a scientist and an entrepreneur, and one of the leading women entrepreneurs in the world today. To my left is Michel Vounatsos, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Biogen. He brings today extensive global visionary leadership experience in the pharmaceutical industry. He has worked with Merck for many years and currently heads Biogen, which has invested billions of dollars in neurological diseases and specifically in Alzheimer's disease. And he has even said it is your mission to work in this particular area. So we are honored to have you as well. And to his left is Dr. Paul Stoffels. And Dr. Paul Stoffels is Vice Chairman and Chief Scientific Officer of Johnson & Johnson. Dr. Stoffel is an infectious disease specialist, one of the world's leading virologists, and was a pioneer in the early days of HIV. And he worked together with a number of other individuals through J&J and in his capacity as a virologist to really develop the drugs and the combination therapies that have changed HIV from a death knell to what it is today, which is a chronic treatable disease. So we're really proud to have these three panelists. So with that, I'd like to start with you, Andrea, first. Could you kindly set the stage for us? Why are you in this field? What are you passionate about? What are you optimistic about?
Thank you. Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Murali. And I would like to thank also Professor Klaus Schwab, who put actually this year Alzheimer on the agenda of Davos, which is in particular important to me because I'm one of the 2009 WEF technology pioneers in Alzheimer. So I'm extremely happy to be here today. I was thinking in preparation of this panel, what is actually important to look at? And I think I'd like to mention some historical milestones. It was actually in 1906 when Dr. Alois Alzheimer, a German pathologist, so there's some motivation on my side, discovered actually the disease. It took 80 years to define the chief components of what we call today Alzheimer plaques and tangles, which are most likely responsible for the cause of a disease. It took another 10 years until FDA approved the first drug, which is a symptomatic drug which can only change the symptoms but not treat the disease at the root. And it was only in 2013 then at the G8 summit in London, an international initiative was launched to actually fight the disease and find a cure. So, as Murali nicely said, there were lots of disappointments in the development of diseases which can really stop the progression of a disease, stop the pathology. However, I think you would agree with me that giving up is not an option. So what I hope to do today is to show some of the advances which were made together with my colleagues and convince you that there is tangible progress made and in fact there is hope. And let me give you 6 reasons for hope. One is science has advanced dramatically. We have first clinical results which permit hope that there will be a treatment even before 2025. We have, in fact, digital health technology which accelerates, changes some of the approaches which we have today to the benefit of the patients and their caregivers. We have the first precision medicine aspects coming up, which, coming from oncology 35 years later, is late, but there is hope. We have advances in biomarkers, potentially validated biomarkers, which would allow us to shorten clinical trials to get approvals of drugs based potentially on biomarkers. We have an FDA regulators opening up to approvals based on such biomarkers. And in fact, there is the wish by the regulators and the scientific community for combination therapy. So, ending up my small introduction, I think what I would like to say is we are all in the same boat. And we cannot allow that this boat is sinking. In fact, it's for our generation, the generation of our parents, or future generation. And therefore, the 2025 goal to have a treatment for Alzheimer should be on the mind of all the stakeholders, of all of us, and I think should be on the agenda of Davos, as Alzheimer is something which touches the world as a whole. And if there would be an efficacious treatment, it would change the state of the world. So while I was talking, probably 100 patients were identified with Alzheimer, because there's one every 3 seconds. So we cannot look away. Thank you.
That's right. Very well said. Michel, so Biogen is a neuroscience pioneer. And when some companies are getting out of the field, in fact, Biogen has doubled down on Alzheimer's and a variety of other neurological diseases. Can you tell us a little bit about why, as a company, you're passionate about this area and where you see the reason for optimism?
Well, simply, Alzheimer's is becoming the public health crisis of the 21st century. So when we think about the 170 million European citizens, 10 million live with dementia. This is more than the population of Switzerland. By 2030, it will be 14 million. Globally, it's 50 million that will become by 2030, 82 millions and trillions in spent. So how do we manage as a community, as a society, this crisis? And I think there are reasons for hope. The first one is to follow the science. And as you clearly said, this is the mission of Biogen. We dedicate our R&D spend to neuroscience and neurological diseases. We have 6 programs under development within Biogen, 2 hypotheses, the amyloid beta and the tau. We have 2 phase 3 ongoing, and the more advanced molecule for which the readout will be in a year from now of the phase 3 is aducanumab. So there is hope. We should not claim victory, any victory, before we have the results. But we'll have the opportunity to learn and to advance. The disease is so complex. It affects the patients, it affects the caregivers, it affects the family. They fall into isolations. They become eventually more demented. We need to stop this vicious circle. And therefore, we need to collaborate. We need to do better than we have done ever. We need to collaborate as a society if we want to be a threat to this rampant epidemic. So this is what is motivating us. This is what is motivating me as a company. And it brings me to my third reason, and we need to learn from the past. And I have a virologist on my left. We need to learn from the past, and I think that the society was able to fend off and to manage with some kind of success some big threats that we had. And I will have one benchmark, which is HIV/AIDS. But it took us 30 years in order to bring together as a comprehensive answer to HIV/AIDS diagnostics, antiretroviral therapies, policies, preventive measures, supports to the patients, and much more. So this is our mission. This is my vision as a person and as a leader, and as a patient potentially, to take this HIV/AIDS experience as a benchmark with a sense of urgency, because I don't believe that we have 30 years. If we wait 30 years, there will be millions of patients that will evolve from mild cognitive impairment to the disease, with all the societal, economical, and all the burdens that it brings.
Paul, Janssen and J&J have been champions of psychiatry and neurology for perhaps 5 decades or more, and I still prescribe one of J&J's drugs for Alzheimer's. It's a symptomatic medication. It's one of the first that was on the market. Can you tell us a little bit about where you see reason for optimism and J&J's sort of view on the field?
The first reason we are in, and is, as you see this show of hands in the room with the first question, is that we are all affected. And as people in companies, we are just normal people who want to solve problems in the world who are very important. And a company is always a collection of people who decide what they want to work on. And if enough people see the mission and the vision of solving a big problem, you can get it done. But the personal motivation has to be there to keep it going, because this is a very challenging field. The second, as a company, is that we are the largest healthcare company in the world, and we can only survive in the future if we focus on real relevant healthcare questions. Yeah, and I think that's why we continue to be very committed to global health, global public health, because that is what we do as a focus, and that's where the problems are which we have to solve. Janssen, we have been in, we had, thanks to the founder of a pharmaceutical group, Dr. Paul Janssen, we have always had a mission on going after big medical needs. Yeah? And when Dr. Janssen started in the late 50s, early 60s, it was before there were really important psychiatry medicines, and it was, was a big challenge. 1% of the people in the world have one or another kind of schizophrenia or psychiatry disease. And he made Haldol as the first one. For 60 years in a row, we have been innovating on continuing to optimize the therapy, and time after time we have been able to jump and do much better. And today we are working on 1 every 3 month antipsychotic, which now could be 4 injections a year to keep people healthy. And Husseini and the team, they're working on 1 every 6 months. And now the products come to such a point that they're also applicable globally in the emerging and developing world, because the healthcare infrastructure need is much lower if you have very applicable products. So what you talked about HIV 30 years is that's typically the time you need to do the basic science, to do the development, to get to a 1st generation, 2nd generation, 3rd generation, and the optimal ultimate therapy who can help the world on a large scale. Today, you all benefit from the great antibiotics which are there, which were all invented 20, 30, 40 years ago. Cardiovascular medicine, blood pressure pills, the products keeping diabetes under control. All of that are products which reach you after much of research and many different forms. And so we have to have a protected long-term research effort here to get to those medicines in order to treat the millions of people with dementia. As said earlier, the challenge of dementia, and we experienced it in our family personally, is really tough. Yeah? And like you say, it takes full-time support for people to take care. And if people go to institutions, then the burden on society, I don't think there is a more expensive disease than Alzheimer over time to deal with. And the world will not be able to cope with it. So in HIV, with a very significant comprehensive effort and pre-competitive effort with the regulators, with the academics, we were able to move fast. Based on those platforms, industry could make new drugs, compete, and get to 20 new drugs now. People, life expectancy in '83, when the first AIDS patients were described, to now was 2 years max in '83. Today it's just normal life, minus 1 or 2 years, because of maybe taking chemistry for so long could have an influence. That is 40 years of healthy life for people. And so it is possible. I'm a big believer that it's possible, but we'll have to put a lot of resources, people, and efforts in the world together to get to that point. And we here at the podium, I think we all know that. Yeah.
You want to add to that? Sure.
Yeah, if I may. And my point is that the medicines alone will not solve it. They are very important, but it will take a collective societal effort in order to do what we have done for HIV. And the medicine alone, based on the continuum of the disease, which is too complex, from diagnosis to infusions capabilities, infrastructure today is not here. And we have some major gaps, and we need to face that. And that's why we need the efforts, the collegial effort of the society.
Public-private partnerships, which is really what the World Economic Forum is sweet spot. So I want to turn to science a little bit, because there's a lot of pessimism caused by some recent failures. I want to throw out one fact for the audience. I know a number of you raised your hands saying that you know somebody, but what many of you may not know is something like 20 new genes have been discovered in the recent decade or so linked to Alzheimer's. And something like 25% of all Caucasians have inherited a gene that either doubles or triples their risk for Alzheimer's disease. So we're all in the same boat. And the number of people at risk for Alzheimer's is almost 25% of the population, at least the Western population. So I want to ask you a question, Andrea. So we've had a very high failure rate of drugs in the last decade or so. In fact, we have not had any new drug perhaps for 15 years or longer. Is it because we don't understand the science, or is it because the trials were not done correctly, or we're just learning how to do better trials and designing trials at the right stage of the disease?
I would say it's probably a little bit of both. I think we are learning that we need to have proper diagnostics, so inclusion criteria for patients, meaning patients who have this beta-amyloid before you actually start a trial, because in the past, more than 30% of the patients didn't actually have these plaques. So that is certainly important. We need to have drugs which really target what is the culprit of the disease. And when you talk in general, the public does not sometimes understand that it's not about A beta, but there are different forms of it, and that it's actually one particular form which is responsible for the cause of the disease. So we need to be specific for the target. I think we need to be able to target high enough so that we can really get enough of the compound into the brain. And most importantly, I think the biggest learning of this last 10 years is that we have to treat early, before the disease has killed the neurons. So
how early would that be? Can you explain to the audience, and how you catch somebody at that stage?
Yeah, so this is of course a challenge, but today we are treating what we call prodromal patients, so patients who have cognitive impairment and have the A beta positivity, so early, but they do not have yet clinical functional impairment. Do we know if this is early enough? Actually, no. But the good news again is that there are prevention trials, so primary prevention trials now ongoing. There are at least 6 now, which actually look at healthy people with a genetic predisposition to get even an aggressive type of a disease. And actually, my big hope is that one of these trials will show if you treat these patients early enough, which is even before cognitive impairments occur, you can actually prevent the disease. In fact, what I would like to see still in my lifetime is that there is the news that we can prevent Alzheimer. And if this is the case, then of course we should have a vaccine which allows us to pre-symptomatic, preclinical prevent the disease rather than treatment. So my vision of the field is really the earlier the better, and ideally preventive.
And Michel, that leads very nicely. As a pharmaceutical CEO, I was surprised when you said you're passionate about healthy aging, because it's usually the opposite side, right? When people age healthy, they don't need medicines. What does it mean to age healthy, and what should companies be partnering with civil society to promote healthy aging? And how do you see a role for big pharma and big companies, tech companies and others?
So living longer and or living better. And I think that this is a good question for the society, because we can see a clear correlation between the life expectancy and the incidence, and also the total epidemiology of neurodegenerative diseases. So I think that it's a beautiful objective that everybody should have, but the reality is basically, it's a bit naive, because the reality is different. The more you age, the more you struggle with the pain and other diseases that affect basically all parts of the society, including the budgets for the governments and for the payers. 8 to 10 times more. 5% of the population costs, 60% of the, etc. So I think we need to redefine what does it mean healthy aging based on the threats that we see, based on Alzheimer's, etc., and eventually the hope that eventually we'll put back the balance at the right time. If we come back to Alzheimer's disease, if we look at the pathophysiology of the disease starts actually 2 decades before the first symptoms. So you have the first plaque occurring and forming 2 decades before the first symptoms.
That's right.
So this is where we need the intervention before, we have neuronal impact, loss that are difficult to repair, as we all know. So this is where we need to have the incentives, the public health attention, diagnostic tests, but also science to best educate us on the best modalities in order to intervene early, as Andrea said. And I believe that if we intervene early, we put ourselves and the society into the most cost-effective intervention in order to increase the probability of healthy aging. This is my view.
Very well said. And for the audience, even though Alzheimer's is considered separate from, say, vascular dementia or cardiovascular disease, they're very strong correlates. We know now that cardiovascular risk factors are very, very important risk factor also for Alzheimer's disease, and anything you can do to keep your heart healthy is good for the brain. So I'm going to turn to Paul. You played leading roles through your company in two major coalitions, two major public-private partnerships, the World Dementia Council, as well as one in the semiconductor industry. Could you tell us some lessons you've learned from that, and what should we be doing that we are not doing currently? Where are the gaps? What are the partnerships we should be forming right now?
First, on the semiconductor, I was not involved with J&J Janssen. I was on behalf of the Flemish government on the board of that. And in that type of in the industry, what they did with companies, they brought together for pre-competitive research in order to accelerate all the chips we have in our phones. They planned that 5 years on beforehand, making sure that together they increase the state of the technology, and then they competing. Yeah? So many companies contributed now to a big institution, 3,500 people, 600 million budget a year. They do pre-competitive research together, and people can participate or not. So in dementia, at a certain point, the World Dementia Council was formed by Prime Minister Cameron so many years ago as part of the then G8. And part of that was how do we accelerate the time to medicine? And so there were different blocks identified. We need more venture capital for Alzheimer, yeah, because VCs, they don't like to see a 30-year return. They want to see the next 5 or 10-year return. So, and there was a very limited VC money going into dementia. So we set up the Dementia Discovery Fund together between a few companies, the government, starting with, in the beginning, 120 million. And then that went reasonably well. Yeah, they started investing into translational medicine from academics. And then suddenly, a friend Bill Gates showed up as a big commitment, and he brought his friends. And today the fund has $350 million or pounds or euros, I don't know, 350. Take that, and it's now a big effort in order to at least kick off new translational medicine, new early discovery projects with venture capital, which is supported by companies and foundations and wealthy people. That was part of the pre-competitive collaboration. Many more, and we can discuss later, but many more happened with the NIH. And unfortunately, Francis Collins couldn't be here today because of the government shutdown in the US. He would have liked to be on the panel. He apologizes he couldn't be there, right, because he is one of the big promoters of the collaborative Alzheimer research, and we can come back on that, as well as IMI in Europe and several foundations. So a lot of pre-competitive activities are happening to improve the state of the science in order then to move faster together. Yeah, that is, that's happening. And it's always it was like the beginning in HIV. Big problem, global problem, massive number of people dying. The world got in panic, what do we need to do? And then industry got together, academic, the regulators, everyone got together. What do we need first? Yeah, we were counting in the early days of HIV, and some of you might remember that, we were counting deaths as an endpoint. Yeah, that was like very rough and very tough because when we did drug discovery, you had to have more people alive than dead. Yeah, and that was the control. Then, together between industry, regulators, academia, we validated the viral load as a biomarker, and that changed the whole field. From counting deaths, now it was counting viral load at 6 months into the game. Viral load was validated with survival, and 6 month therapy measuring the viral load. First, it was 0.6 log reduction in viral load, which was a measure to get approval. So industry got a reasonable barrier to go fast and approve new drugs. Then it was number of undetectable later. as we could bring patient to undetectable much better and earlier. And that gave a whole flux of new research because we could very fast learn whether a drug works, yes or no. But then we learned that it was combinations who really made it work. Right. And then between the companies, we started to collaborate on using all these combinations and all these different combinations.
What did it take for companies to collaborate? Normally, you know, there's so much worried about patent protection and secrecy, and how did they actually get companies? And I would love all of you to comment on that, because that seems to be there are a lot of silos in the field.
No, it was very simple. If we combined, we had an undetectable viral load and people survived lifelong. Okay. If we didn't combine, we got resistant virus and patients were on your drug for 2 or 3 months and they were off. So there was the business model, or the patient outcome was driven by combinations, and therefore everyone collaborated with each other in order to get to the best possible combinations. The viral load did it, the biomarkers on resistance did it, and the combinations. But what was also very important is the regulatory pathway. In the world we got, and that was the regulatory pathway was very quickly adopted, that within 6 months every drug was approved, 6 months after submission, sometimes much faster. And that gave fast access to new medicines, and the people who are living now who would have a life expectancy of probably 2 to 4 years now live lifelong, and that is because of this collaborative effort, pre-competitive, competitive, as well as regulators and between industry.
Great. I'm going to ask you one question, but before I would, let's assume we have a successful drug on the market in the next 4 to 5 years, that one of these drugs succeed. I don't know what the pricing model is going to be. It's going to be an immunotherapy, maybe given as a vaccine, maybe an oral pill. Regardless, it will not cure the condition. They will still need to be caregivers. And access to care, access to expensive drugs is still going to be an issue throughout the world. Would welcome thoughts from you as to what we should be doing to improve access and what should we be doing to help caregivers, because there's an enormous burden still on caregivers, and I am not really seeing a systematic effort to change that in a big way. What can we do?
So if I may, one point on the healthy tension between collaboration and competition.
Yes.
So my view is that there is no dichotomy between both, but there is interdependency.
Yep.
We need some level of financing in order to fuel R&D, and at the same time, we cannot survive and progress if we don't learn from each other.
Yes.
Concerning access and the global care of this pandemic, I think this is really based on the mass and the magnitude of the epidemiology. This is something that we need to tackle upfront. And my view is that we need disruptive thinking. The old model, the way it worked traditionally, including the pharma model, has to evolve.
Yes.
We need to be innovative in the way we contract with payers. The fee-for-service eventually has to evolve towards more a population health approach. What has made previously the success of the pharma model eventually didn't meet the needs of the larger population. This is not sustainable, because this is why we have this image as pharma industry, and this is why there are so many reactions, and so be it. So we need to be innovative in the way we reach, the way we treat, the way we contract, the way we partner, diagnosis, modalities of infusion, monitoring, and much more. This is my view. And for that, again, it's all about collaboration.
Yeah. Andrea, any thoughts on, I know you started to say something and I apologize.
No, I wanted actually to follow up on what Paul said. I think for me, key to all of this, and I was really thinking before this panel, what has to happen in order to have a breakthrough here? And for me, it always comes back to early diagnostic and surrogate markers. I think as industries, private-public partnerships, regulators, I think we need to work together on this particular aspect. How can we establish a surrogate marker for this disease? How can we validate it? I think we have to work with FDA to tell us what is actually required for them to accept a surrogate biomarker, which could then function as an conditional endpoint, as an accelerated endpoint, whatever it might be, because then we can think about combinations, because we have something which we can evaluate very quickly. So I think that step has to happen.
I cannot agree more with what you said, and I am very encouraged by the FDA guidelines issued a year ago, This is very encouraging. But this should lead for early intervention and early treatment. And if we circle back to HIV, when we had the treatment, we started to treat the most severe patients only. We had to have a CD4 count that was relatively low.
Yes.
And before we evolved to much more preventative measures and early treatment.
That's great. So I think I want to open up for some questions, and then we'll give everybody again a chance to, yes, please.
Thank you so much.
Please introduce yourself. And
my name is Cyril Vetter. I take full-time care of my mother with Alzheimer's, and my grandmother have it, and I have a marker for it. A doctor in the United States, Dale Bredinson, recently wrote a book, End of Alzheimer's, in which he claimed that he can not only stop the advance of Alzheimer's, but actually reverse the effects of it. Some of it seems quite normal and logical with the exercise, health, social interaction, but others of it are following quite a strict protocol. Do you have any perspective on that? Is he a quack? Is he on to something? I want to know today. Thank you so much.
who wants to take that question?
I mean, I've read the book, but
I didn't read the book.
Oh, well, if you read the book,
To hire them.
well,
I know Dale, so I'll reserve my comments. But
let me say, as you probably know, my background is also a food background, so I strongly believe in nutrition, lifestyle, exercise, and there is, in fact, quite good evidence that if you have a healthy lifestyle, there's a finger study, you actually can really improve your conditions.
can you explain the finger a little bit? What the people may not know what that study is.
Yeah, the finger study is a study in Finland where we're looking at nutrition, at exercise, education, cardiac training, etc., etc. And we're really, and I think the important part is also the social part, is people get really together and talk about their disease. So there are 4 components. And the effects have been tremendous. So in a way, I do believe on certain, I would say I believe it's such aspects, such framework, the family, the stimulation can actually really help. But it cannot totally prevent the disease. I mean, so this is a very clear aspect. So yes, the book is there. I would say when it comes to the overall lifestyle impact, I would support it. I think nutrition, by the way, this is something we have not even touched. I mean, we are speaking here about drugs only. I think there is a lot which nutrition can actually contribute. We're speaking about the microbiome being so important. Well, influencing the microbiome could be a very important aspect also for preventing of a disease. So in part, I believe in the book, but not all.
So there's this old saying, right? Genetics loads the gun, lifestyle pulls the trigger. So with that, I'll come to you, yes. Please.
Hi, I'm Cliff Brangman from Princeton University. I just wanted to make the point, so I come from a very basic research background. I always thought of what I was doing was just trying to figure out how nature works, not particularly about immediate translation to disease, even though there's, obviously I recognize the urgency of it. But in some of the research that we've done, we've discovered, new ways of understanding the organization in living cells. This concept of phase transitions, where you have liquids that condense in cells, and those liquids can be metastable and actually turn into solid states. And that started to shed light on many of these neurodegenerative diseases, ALS and Alzheimer's, sort of strongly implicated. I tell you that just because I think even while there is an immediate urgency, and the previous question, I also have incredible concerns in my own family. My wife's grandmother has Alzheimer's, and I worry about that.
What was the question?
Well, the question is it's really a statement, which is I think we need to invest even in very basic
Science.
cell biology research.
Absolutely.
So much of the roadblocks, I think, come from fundamental mechanisms of protein-protein interactions and protein homeostasis are not understood.
Yes.
And so I think even while there's an urgency for translation, we have to invest even in very basic research.
Paul, do you want to take that?
Yeah.
It,
Please, Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely right. And I think Francis Collins and at the NIH were able to attract significant additional money to now distribute to either at the NIH or to centers. I think industry is working on, in a collaboration with NIH in AMP on new mechanisms understanding the disease, but it's not good enough. I think if we would tackle it today like we are tackling cancer, then you would see something else on basic research ongoing in the world and accelerate 10 times faster than with the amount of resources which are there today. And also the number of researchers which are attracted into this disease, because often it has to do with, can we attract money in that area to do basic research? So hopefully it will get going, but the urgency, I think, is needed to even do more, significantly more.
Yes, you had a question, right?
Yes, my name is Yasser Mufti. I'm an executive with Saudi Aramco. This is my ticket to attend this session is my father has Alzheimer's, but I also sit on the board of a hospital, a JV that we have with Johns Hopkins. We spun out a hospital, a 300-bed facility, and one of the things that we have to work on, or we are working on, is deciding which areas of research we can expand a very well-run hospital into. And I was just thinking, what role do developing economies play in finding a solution for this very pressing global problem? I would argue, at least from personal experience, that the social costs are equally tragic, and the demographic, the aging of societies, not the least China. These economies in these countries are not as well equipped as perhaps Europe and the US to deal with the challenges of an aging population increasingly dealing with
very well said.
Cases.
The biggest growth in Alzheimer's is going to be in India and China in the coming decades. Michel, we want to take that, given your experience with global economies.
So I had the opportunity and the privilege to live in your beautiful country for 4 years. So, there, it's not about the GDP per capita nor the level of development that will set the governance and the leadership and the willingness to tackle, public health priorities. And we are working all around the world to find center of expertise that could be the benchmark for others to follow. For example, Japan is one. There is a whole engagement of policy leaders from the top of the hierarchy to every ministries in order to tackle this challenge. They have the Orange Plan. 1 in 5 citizens by the end of the next decade will be demented beyond the age of 60. So they all realize they need to act together. And again, it's not the develop or developing, it's more the governance and the leadership.
Yes, there's a question there.
I'm Joanne Jenkins, the CEO of AARP. We represent 38 million Americans over the age of 50, and obviously dementia, Alzheimer is very high on the list. We're also the largest investor in the Dementia Discovery Fund.
Absolutely.
But our focus has really been on helping the caregiver. And I'm wondering if there are certain skill sets or areas that we ought to be focusing on, because we always say you're either going to be a caregiver or you're going to need a caregiver.
That's right.
And how do we prepare caregivers, particularly around the issues of Alzheimer and other forms of dementia?
Excellent question. Would like to take that, Andrea?
You also know that very often the caregiver dies faster than the patient because of the stress it brings to the person who has to take care of an Alzheimer patient. And that's where I think society, communities, we have to start training, informing people, but also one person cannot take care of an Alzheimer patient. It has to be a team of people, because otherwise it's so exhausting that people don't survive. And communities will have to get organized. Families will have to get organized. There are new systems being tested out. There is a dementia village in Holland, in the Netherlands, where people are brought together. There are different types of community testing out, where they bring people together with a reasonable support from family, but also from government care, to make it easier. But those living systems for how to live together or how to take care will have to be developed, and it will be a big burden to society.
So there are some very good experiences in some pockets of the world. Again, In the UK, there are helplines where people can call just to be listened, because those caregivers very often they fall into isolations, which is just terrible. And there are certainly some e-solutions to be developed beyond the medicinal intervention in order to provide support and be a platform whereby people can have a partner while managing somebody with a disease.
Yeah. Yesterday we learned from the psychiatrist from Zimbabwe on how the friendship bench, which you can see here, on how simple tools in mental health are able to train and to learn people how to take care of other people with mental health problems. And I think their grandparents are being used to do that, or being deployed to do that. I think in mental health, in dementia, similar systems will be need to be developed on what are pragmatic systems for supporting people. Yeah.
The majority of caregivers are women, and they call the sandwich generation because they're caring not only for the children but also for their parent with the disease. Yes, please.
My name is Christine Andrea, Norway. I have a question. We hear a genetic factor and that it could help slow down with healthy food and exercise. But what mental stress? Do you have any research on to which degree that have a negative influence on the disease?
There is research now of the prognostic studies which exactly show now scientifically supported that this is really happening, but it is absolutely clear that stressful situations, etc., are influencing such conditions. Once more, I don't think this mental stress can actually induce the pathology, which is A beta and tau in Alzheimer's disease. But it's a contributing factor. And one thing I wanted to say actually to you, whenever these proteins come up in the pathology, actually they come up not just alone, but they come up in combinations. And what we are learning right now is that it's not just about A beta and tau, there are other proteins also coming up in the brain. And the question is really, is there an underlying mechanism? Is, for example, inflammation a factor which is even earlier as A beta? In fact, I'm getting to a point where we say, well, A beta is early, but is it really the earliest? And as you well know, mental stress and nervous are inducing such inflammatory aspects. So I think there is a lot to learn, and over the next years, I think we will really delineate what is really first and what is the sequence of his proteins. And that's why I strongly believe in precision medicine, because unless you really know what the patient has, you cannot treat the patient according to the pathology, the underlying pathology. So I think this step to go, which we have done in cancer 35 years ago, has to happen in our area as well.
I see a question in the back. I'll come to you next.
Hi, Monica Weinberg. I'm a physician from New York, and I just want to follow up on your comment on inflammation, because I've heard this being talked about a little bit, and I know that that's linked to our immune system, and I'm wondering what the data is and what trials have been done on immune modulators in terms of trying to diminish the amyloid plaque formation, similar to what we're doing in other diseases like cancer. We have immunotherapy.
At the moment, most of the data are in mice, so we are just about, as a scientific community, to investigate the first neuroinflammatory inhibitors. They are in phase 1. So I would say we have to wait until we have evidence if inhibiting inflammation can really contribute to the overall outcome of a disease. I strongly believe that it will be a combination therapy between tackling the plaques, tackling the tangles, plus the inflammation. I think we're really looking into combination therapy.
Anything you want to add on, Paul, given your long history with immunotherapy? Okay. You had a question there.
Hi, my name is Melanie Knudsen. My question is, what are the quantifiable indicators with which you measure the effectiveness of various treatment options?
wants to take that? Paul?
I didn't understand the question.
I will just give one measure. So far, in very early stage of our clinical development of our lead compound, a long-term extension of phase 1, we can show that beyond removing the plaque, we have a slowdown of the cognitive erosion. And so it's too early because the N was very small, but then we'll be educated much more when we have the final results in a year from now. But based on the literature, if we're able to delay the onset of the disease, we decrease the prevalence by 50%, almost 50% by 2050. So this is significant.
Yes.
So in terms of diagnostics, do you, and reaching sort of an end to this goal, do you see it as an immunization like you have for measles and all that, or something you would advise like a mammogram for breast cancer? Where do you see Alzheimer's?
This is a very difficult question. I would say the answer is we don't know yet. We don't know what antibody titers, for example, we really need. So the measurement which we have today is really to look at this A-beta load and the reduction of it, and in link to that, the cognitive improvement. But going towards what I said at the beginning, hopefully we can establish one of these markers as a surrogate marker, meaning it correlates directly with a clinical outcome. And if we have such a marker, which might not be A-beta, it might be tau, then this would be a huge step forward, because then we could simply look, for example, at the tau load, which very nicely correlates with cognition.
Luciani and the team, we are doing a lot of digital work on how with digital means, but also retinoscopy, as well as with markers. And if you do that cognitive, digital, and all the markers together, we can almost 100% predict 3 years before you do Alzheimer that you're going to do it. Yeah, so it's still complicated, but the combination of different markers have a high predictive score now. So those type of predictive markers will be needed to be able to start and initiate therapy for patients. And that's where we're trying to simplify that, trying to find simple early diagnostics. But most probably, Google will be able already to know almost whether we have the early symptoms based on how many times you search for the same thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Absolutely. Your refrigerator may know before you do.
So
based on how long the food has been there, the expired yogurt has been sitting in there, right? And hopefully it'll send a message to your doctor or somebody, or to you or your spouse.
I think it's going to go very fast.
I know Biogen's also very active in digital technologies for both early detection and potentially for monitoring disease, etc. Anything you would like to share in that?
Yeah, big time. I think digitalization and building e-engagement with the customer base, e-solutions, digitalization of the R&D and also the manufacturing process is a priority at Biogen.
Should we be sharing data? I know we're talking about big data generated from all of these studies, these tests, using artificial intelligence. Are we doing enough to share data amongst companies, amongst academic institutions? What are the plans in the field for big data sharing and creating a common platform?
Let me tell what happened in HIV. If you want to establish an early marker or a biomarker, you have to share it, otherwise it's not a standard. Right. So you have to share, we share all the data in that space on making sure that the regulators and that it's validated. So it's very important to that is established as a early diagnosis. It should be a common tool in the world. It should not be owned by any one company, because that will be a standard tool or a tool to be used. So I think it will all enhance the availability of new medicines.
Yeah, I can only support. We are part of, under the umbrella of the NIH, of a diagnosis effort with 20 companies and again the public leader that coordinates this effort in terms of research. But there is always much to be done, much more to be done.
Right.
I know you've been also very vocal in supporting these kinds of public-private
I think
efforts.
it's absolutely necessary, again, to have a biomarker validated, accepted by regulators. I think we have to combine data sets, we have to compare data sets, and it's impossible that one company, certainly not a small biotech, can do such large validation studies. So we need to work together.
So I want to ask Paul one question, because as a virologist. Today, many of you may have read in the news that Alzheimer's may be triggered by an infection in your gums, and they identified a microbial organism that causes infection of the gums, and apparently that's what it is, and someone's developing a drug for it. So what are your thoughts as a virologist? Are we coming back to Alzheimer's as an infection, activation of herpes? What do you think of that theory?
And I'm not expert enough to say that. If it was only that, it would be easy to prevent. Yeah. So if you all know the story about HPV, the human papilloma vaccine. So at that moment now, you can prevent the cancer caused by human papillomavirus with a vaccine. Yep. If it was that easy, we would go fast. So I have no scientific insight in that publication to make any statements on that.
Okay. So I think we have about 5 minutes or so left, and I would love to have each of our panelists make a closing statement. Also share with us what is the commitment that you're willing to make to address some of the challenges and gaps, and working together, and in the spirit of the forum, really a public-private partnership to address the gaps and really help both people and caregivers in space. So perhaps you want to start.
I can start. On the one hand, we continue to do the basic research in order to get to new molecules and new approaches. The early diagnostic, we have a big commitment. All the different partnerships we are doing with in pre-competitive research, the clinical trial preparation, the biomarkers, we are all part of that. As an industry leader, I take the lead, or I drive in IMI and through FNIH and in different organizations. I try to make sure we progress, and I will continue to do that. What will be needed is a much bigger global call to action. You know? Yes. At a certain point, the G8 at the meeting, all the ministers of health were there, all the presidents were there. It was top of the agenda in the world. We all agreed to do a number of things. We accelerated things. It has watered down a lot. Yeah, we have to bring it back to the global agenda, because it's one of the most important global public health issues which is coming towards us. And if you don't do it for somebody else, do it for yourself, because you might have a big chance to be subject to the disease. So I think global call to action is needed in order to accelerate this field.
Michel?
So Biogen is a company that is fully dedicated to neuroscience. So we dedicate billions every year to R&D in one space, not two spaces, one space, which are the neurological diseases that happens to become the #1 epidemiology priority. So you have the commitment of all those talents and all those partnerships, direct, indirect, virtual, that makes neuroscience and the discovery and meeting unmet medical need their mission in life. The common thread of the discussion since 1 hour, it's all about the collaborative efforts. And this is what I would like all of us to remember.
Yes, very well said.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more with Paul. We need a global call for action because we're dealing with a problem which is too big for industry, government, single governments, regulators. We need absolutely to work together. And as an entrepreneur and a scientist, I have basically two wishes. One is to create these partnerships between these different stakeholders, so biotech, pharma, governments, regulators, institutions which take care of patients and patients' families, to really work on these common themes. At the same time, I think we need to advance our technologies. I really believe that the global health revolutions which we have in front of us, you mentioned biomarkers, is very important. With digital aspects which we have for recruitment of patients, for measuring the status of a disease, is absolutely essential. We need more of a social science And I was very intrigued yesterday by learning about the mental health and how social and biology scientists have to get together. That requires actually that we have scientists. We have scientists in neuroscience, but I do not believe that we have enough scientists with a multidisciplinary approach which look beyond this natural borders between industry, academia, and regulators. So we need people who think and act globally. And as a last thing, as a scientist, I would love to see a vaccine against Alzheimer, which can prevent Alzheimer before the disease breaks out, and actually can allow to treat people, healthy people, without side effects in an efficacious way. So that's my wish as a scientist.
Fantastic statement. So I just wanted to mention that the forum, the World Economic Forum, has a very deep commitment to mental health and neurological health, and you've seen throughout the sessions a number of programs highlighting these areas. They also have a Global Future Council devoted to this topic, and I'm one of the co-chairs of that. So it's really with that, please join me in giving a hand to our distinguished panelists.